Denji is a bit different. For a mainstream anime protagonist, he doesn't fit the mold. He's selfish, he doesn't care that much about his words. He's motivated purely by self-interest. He has no desire to achieve any bigger goals, but does all of that make Denji a bad protagonist? You read Chainsaw Man, and you have to kind of push through the protagonist being a skirt-chasing hobo, with seemingly no concern for much outside of his immediate needs. Someone who makes near constant, weird and bad decisions, but Denji is a bit more complex than the surface level reading. But is Denji a good protagonist? When we first meet Denji, he's got nothing. In a debt trap, living in a shack, fantasizing over toast. Over the first part of Chainsaw Man, we see Denji gradually getting a better life. He starts so low that even those looking to hurt him have to build him up a little bit first, just to have something to take away. Now, what does this have to do with him being a good protagonist? Well, I think Denji's early progress can be viewed through the lens of the hierarchy of needs, usually shown as a fun little pyramid here. A person, in this case, this guy, has to fulfill the basic human needs like safety and relationships before they can go on and focus on the higher philosophical rewards. Like how Denji has to first get toast and some companionship before we can really start to have those dreams and goals that are more common in fiction. Applying the hierarchy to fictional characters isn't a new concept, it's a good tool for trying to ensure your character's needs ring true. If their motivation matches this basic pyramid form of life, well, you've got the start of a believable character motivation. In Chainsaw Man though, we are almost seeing Denji's goals and wishes played out as he ascends the pyramid of needs. Rather than gaining in power as he defeats devils, he's progressing further up the hierarchy to become less of a stray dog and more of a person. A fully actualized person. His motivation is going from just basic survival to someone with a more complex idea of self. It's this development that's the core of his character journey. This approach to Denji's growth grounds the character in the most core human needs. It makes him a believable figure, but also a unique protagonist. Motivation for characters is an important thing. A person can't move beyond the fulfillment part of those needs we just talked about, where a lot of storytelling is done, if their basic needs are not being met. Denji is a great example of how the hierarchy of needs can potentially drive a character's arc and motivations. It's not just an explanation for Denji's actions, but Denji is an exploration of the hierarchy itself. His motivation might be simple, it's basic, but it's a truthful motivation, one that feels believable, which is the foundation. From the beginning, one thing is clear with Denji: he's a stray. In effect, he's just a stray dog, one that Makima finds and takes in like all of her other stray dogs. Can we have a dog in a human's world as a protagonist? A lot of his early journey and motivation is spent becoming a person. At the very beginning, Denji roughly has a roof over his head. It's not great. In a major city, he'll probably still have outrageous rent, but it's not great. He has no security though, he's essentially owned by the Yakuza. But not that type of Yakuza, like the bad ones. Apparently some actually do crimes and don't just help people find lost cats and run orphanages. Who knew? Denji's situation pre-manga is, it's bad. He doesn't have the space to think of much beyond his immediate survival and core feelings. He has the motivation of an animal, but this doesn't make him a bad protagonist. If anything, it's a mark in his favour. Most in that situation would end up stuck in that kind of mindset. The big jump in his living standards comes when he joins public safety, where his motivation once again lines up really well with the hierarchy of needs. Denji manages to secure the very bottom rung on the hierarchy, physiological needs. He gets a more secure home, and even starts to procure food without a fuss. Denji's next motivation is a basic desire to keep this relatively standard of living? Oh, next up is safety and security, which is a job. Security to maintain a basic standard of living. Essentially the stage where Denji's explicitly willing to do whatever it takes to keep his job. We can pretty closely map Denji's goals and motivations to his progression through each of these needs. He's explicitly building a fuller life. Once Denji's goals progress past his basic needs, he begins to require more complicated things. The next stage up, which is companionship, love, intimacy, belonging, all that kind of stuff, that's where Makima gets more involved, stepping in to allow him to develop these bonds. Bonds with Aki, with power, and without their influence, Rez, even Beam, I guess. I love that guy. These bonds even start to give him a sense of belonging, affection. As he gets more recognition for his devil-killing work, he can start to look at self-esteem too. He later wants recognition and achievement as Chainsaw Man. So far, Denji's progression has closely tracked him developing as a person. Even as Denji gets these things that he's been craving and climbs up the hierarchy of needs, it isn't enough. Jam on Toast goes from being a dream to a reality to something that he's bored by. Denji develops by becoming a more well-rounded person. However, it's the tragedies that keep happening to him that prevent him from reaching these final stages. Here it gets tricky. As he's progressing further, Denji is presented with more complicated problems. I honestly don't see a happy ending for Denji. Does anyone? But he might get to the point where he's fully realised all the way up this pyramid before it's once again stripped away from him. He'd need a new motivation beyond a normal life if he ever got there. And as we're seeing, getting the physical things you technically need isn't always the trick to fulfillment. Even in part 1, Denji's journey up the hierarchy doesn't exactly bring fulfillment. Denji's becoming a fuller person, but it won't necessarily bring happiness. He can find it a little bit empty. He gets to have his jam on toast, but he just gets used to it. Which isn't that far-fetched. It's actually pretty much what happens. According to some studies, satisfaction rarely goes up with attainment of material goals. New ones are just found. Denji is running into one of the most normal problems here. The protagonist might be in extraordinary circumstances, but their progress and development is based on fundamental truths and experiences, just taken to extremes. It's a more interesting way to tell a story, where Denji finds a more secure position and betters himself. He becomes more of a person. I think that's a strong motivation for Denji, which is a good part of a strong protagonist. His motivation isn't that. It's living a normal life, just like his contract says. Denji is a protagonist reduced to the baseline level. He's a human reduced to the base level. It's not pretty sometimes, it's not always likable, but it doesn't make him a bad protagonist. A good protagonist is not the same thing as likable. His basic needs might not be the most recognizable to most, but they're not abstract, they're human, they're universal, and he's this boiled down. Denji is at most times lacking in ego or pretension. He's just a guy, looking for the very minimum in life and usually failing to get it for more than like half an hour at most. He's at his most likable when things are going better for him, yeah, when he has enough security and enough of a life to begin to be a bit more of a person. When this stuff is taken away from him though, he's back to level 1 of all this. He's back to his more animal instincts. Now Denji's more scumbag tendencies do cut down on his relatability, and he's probably less likable because of them, but that doesn't make him uninteresting. A good protagonist doesn't have to be a blank slate that's likable. Denji is enjoyable in being unlikable. Take, for example, an early arc where all of the characters are trying to kill Denji, light-hearted fare like that. He decides his best solution is to just go get eaten because Kabini is annoying him, or stealing Aki's fruit in the hospital, or any of these things. Alright, so he's a bit of a jerk. Being a jerk doesn't stop the character from being interesting though, it makes him more entertaining, if anything. If Denji had the flat reactions of a standardly likable protagonist, these scenes would be pretty cut and dry. Let's try this. Let's try it real quick, and we'll take a little one. Let's take him selfishly stealing fruit from when he visits Aki. Boring. I mean, I'm sure Fujimoto would have written something else interesting, but Denji as an entertaining protagonist often relies on him being unlikable. It's what makes him interesting. Nah, really, is he stupid? Some of the problems that people have with Denji is having to follow a character who seems to be consistently making poor or very, very stupid choices. But, and this is something I'll probably say a lot, interesting is more fun to watch than perfect. Even if he's a moron. I mean, actually, especially if he's a moron. If we say a protagonist can't be a moron, we lose entire genres of work. Good stuff too. Morons can be entertaining in fiction, and the protagonist doesn't have to be smart. It might make him harder to be a self-insert character for the viewer, but it doesn't make him dull. Denji isn't inherently stupid either. He hasn't got an education of any kind, and he seems lacking in some key general knowledge. but he's picked up a few bits and he can have good manners when he wants to, be creative in tight situations. And there's that one time he wore glasses for like a whole day, which is pretty smart. Plus he hangs around with Nobel laureates as well. Some fights he wins by pure stupidity, brute forcing it, sure, but in others he can be really quite clever in tight situations, like in the end of part 1. With Denji's final matchup against Makima, he's smart at the end there. His solution of exploiting her little actual regard for him was, honestly, I mean, it's ingenious. Denji might not be the brightest in every respect, but he's capable of doing clever things sometimes. Most teenage boys aren't the brightest either, for the most part. I mean, I know I wasn't. Denji, who never went to school and seems borderline illiterate at moments, well, up until part 2, you probably can't expect him to be the smartest protagonist out there. If anything, the explanations behind his flashes of genius make him more interesting to follow than if he wasn't, well, an idiot. When you're unwilling to write a non-perfect character, you're eliminating the majority of potential for interesting stories. A character like Denji, heavily flawed, maybe quite dislikable, but with problems, is much more entertaining. He drives conflict better. I don't care if a protagonist is likable as long as their role in pushing forward a good story is there. Denji's quite well designed for that. His goals, his problems, his quest to live life at a decent level, it makes for entertaining reading, much more so than if he was boring. If Denji was a more standard protagonist and smarter, nothing about Chainsaw Man works. Almost any scene in it is rendered much duller and it becomes kind of nothing. You don't have to like Denji, but it's difficult to deny he's a decent protagonist for exploring the story's themes and progress. Denji is a subversion of the type of protagonist you typically see in Shonen Jump. He has no grander ideals, no guiding principle, not even as much as Goku's I wanna fight strong guys shtick. You're not going to see him arguing for some greater good. Most of the motivation we see for him is either A, trying to rail someone, or B, trying to ensure he keeps his standard of living. And it's not a problem. I don't think Kabini has grand ideals too, just beyond staying alive, earning some money. And she's a character tons of people are painfully waiting to see again. So many people in Chainsaw Man have banal motivations, but they're still interesting. It's a more out there world, and Chainsaw Man has the power to erase entire concepts from ever existing, but Denji isn't interested in the big stuff. Denji has no big ideal or morality like a lot of protagonists, but not everyone needs a grand dream. It's fine for Denji's dream to be to live a better life if that leads to interesting stories and exploration of his character. And thanks to the world of Chainsaw Man being a horrible place that seems to exist purely to kick Denji when he's down, it is interesting.
Kick him in when he's down. You are always down.
He's purely self-interested, but Denji's self-interest is engaging. Protagonists don't need to be relatable to be good. Denji's quest for a normal life is no less entertaining than a protagonist with a noble goal. Denji is honest and open with his motivations. His core needs are transparent. Not having a grander ideal suits the journey Denji is going on better. It might not be as grand as saving the world, but it doesn't preclude his journey from being entertaining. Wait, so a charge many have on Denji is that he commits the unspeakable sin of being boring compared to his side character, Pochita. Or sometimes Aki, who is a failed protagonist in some ways, but that's a whole video in of itself. But Pochita, even in the first part of Chainsaw Man, the primary antagonist is more interested in the chainsaws.
1. Poochie needs to be louder, angrier, and have access to a time machine. 2. Whenever Poochie's not on screen, all the other characters should be asking, "Where's Poochie?" 3.
Great.
Not even learning his smell, Denji is so uninteresting to other characters in the world compared to his heart, but Denji is more interesting to the audience because of that. Well, it's the chainsaw that the public are obsessed with too. He's formed key relationships with those who prefer him. These relationships show the strength of Denji as a more grounded character. There are people who like him for him, not for his chainsaws. Aki has a snowball fight with Denji, no chainsaw heart in sight. He tries to drop off the climactic gun devil task force and give up his lifelong driving motivation for Denji. For this little gremlin over here, Power is much more interested in Denji than his heart, but The part where Power has PTSD and Denji realizes what a friendship is, it's beautiful. It brings so much more out of him. Denji isn't just a base level instinct-driven animal, he's capable of being more, and we're seeing him become more. In terms of actual romantic relationships, the thing Denji is often obsessed with, Rez is the most interesting, being almost a legitimate romantic interest. Like so many of Denji's relationships, it's characterized by him not being completely aware of what's happening. He's always the last one to figure out what's actually going on, that he's being manipulated. Although this time it's not just Denji getting played. A lot of this section has some strong characterization for him, and it's a place where he's at his strongest, like him going to the coffee shop, just making human connections. Denji's strengths in this section come from him being a normal guy under it all. He's an effective protagonist, and part of that is how naturally he can switch gears into this cute section without a blink. Something we see again in part 2, really. Denji, at the end of the Rez arc, is still willing to forgive her. What's most interesting about this arc, for the question of if Denji is a good protagonist, is that Rez raises the possibility that he could have a life outside of Makima's control. The idea that he could go to school, have a girlfriend, one that's not the head of the monster killing department he's kept as an employee/prisoner for, or sharing a body with something only out to kill him. Rez seems to show a possibility that he could complete his contract with Vegeta. She actually gives Denji the possibility of a real life, and then it's pulled out from under him. I think for a lot of people, it's this possibility from Rez that makes their relationship so compelling. Denji is a less fully formed person in part 1. This opens up the possibilities for this type of storytelling, which just wouldn't work with a more traditional protagonist. In the end, it's quite sad where Rez provides a bit of a parallel to his upbringing. Makima is the representation of control, manipulation is part of that, and Denji manages to beat her as his character is finally developing past being so naively manipulated all the time. Rez and being offered the possibility of a world outside of what he's told is a big part of that though, it's the turning point almost. She manages to push him further in that journey to becoming a full person. It's why so many are still yearning for a reunion. This progress is possible because of where Denji starts. Denji isn't static, he grows, as a good protagonist should. Something we keep coming back to is that Denji is better rounded than a basic protagonist would be. He has some pretty big flaws, but even these are built to inform us about his motivation and open up more interesting possibilities for his growth. Starting with his complete lack of socialization. He grew up in some dire circumstances, struggling for basic substance. Of course he's lacking in social niceties. His background really does explain a flaw that some people have with Denji, that he's a dirtbag. He's going to be one, he's a teenage boy raised by the Yakuza. It would be weirder if he had that background and inexplicably became a normal protagonist by episode 2. Projecting expectations from worse written anime tropes onto Denji covers a lot of frustrations with his flaws. Even his interest in the ladies isn't really out of field. He's a 16-year-old boy. It doesn't really have to go much deeper than that. That's a factor that's often blown out of proportion too, and probably just because those moments are funny or jarring enough to be memorable. Denji isn't so two-dimensional that this overrides his basic function. He doesn't even really care about his reward after the gun fiend debacle. He's just devastated about the loss. He's just a person. Denji is the person that would come out of his background. His character arc works with the flaws, and he's a compelling center point for the story being told. He isn't made to be 100% likable. In some ways, Denji's sole goal of trying to live an okay life is a fun boiling down of shonen tropes. He's not even all that unorthodox though. He has the base level focus on a goal that a lot of shonen protagonists have too. It's just that his dream is kind of just a dud. If I lived in a world with devils, I think I'd align more closely with the goals there. Just try and not die. Though then we're again going back to Kabini territory. Denji's goals are to live an okay life in a hellish world. He's different from a traditional protagonist in some ways, but close enough in others that this contrast works. Denji's main differences come from boiling down some of those themes to something more human, more understandable. We can root for him to go 10 days without having his life ruined. I like that in a protagonist. Even if I think he's awful half the time, I can understand his struggles, which is half the battle with a main character. Denji's personal journey is a lot more about maturing than a lot of similar manga. earlier, Denji might not have the more stereotypical developmental coming-of-age arc, but in actually showing the formation of Denji as a fully formed adult over this long time period, it's more grounded and a more interesting depiction of those themes. It's boring if he's fully developed within a week. What I'm driving at with a lot of this is that a non-perfect protagonist is better for exploring the themes of Chainsaw Man than a traditional one. Even as a character, Denji's smaller and more normal goals make his personality more compelling and give him scope for an original character journey. He is well defined, he's clear, he's a dirtbag that I understand. A more traditional protagonist wouldn't have Denji's drive to achieve the bare minimum. They'd probably already have that. That wouldn't allow us to go through the fundamental building blocks of the human experience and explore them in as much depth as we can do with Denji. Denji allows us to explore the idea of coming of age, of becoming an adult, by breaking down the steps needed to become a person. That's great protagonist material, and as his needs get more complex in part 2, he just gets more interesting. When he does pop back up after a little absence in part 2, it's really surprising how much I missed this little gremlin. Then, yeah, he pretty quickly reveals his new job. Denji isn't a perfect protagonist. He's a lot more real in a role that usually demands the unreal, and that makes him more interesting. Even if his life is a carnival of misery and his desires basic, he's not even OP in combat or anything. One of his biggest feats in part 1 is just brute forcing a fight for 72 hours. He's just grinding, man. Another is tricking an undefeatable enemy by realizing that she doesn't care about him. These are great wins too, because they make sense for Denji. The Makima conclusion particularly ends a major arc and plot point with a solution that can only work through the character's development so far. It's a perfect rounder to the arc, and without as strong of a defined protagonist as Denji, this clever kind of stuff just doesn't work. Denji's eventual dream and contract being essentially limited to being happy with his life. It's an unachievable goal. As we get more in life, satisfaction rarely rises, especially Denji, who he's never going to be able to complete his contract with Vegeta. With or without the constant sources of pain, he's pushing a rock up a hill forever. He might not be a good person, but Denji is definitely interesting, and he's perfect for exploring the themes of Chainsaw Man, which makes him a good protagonist.